Well, this week we're still messing around with the logging railroad.
Yes, it's quite a project.
Last week we more or less finished up the locomotive shop.
Right.
And we've got a few little small details still to do. We've also laid track all the way to the end of Steve Stribble's module. So here's a track plan.
Oh, it's a T-shape. That's cool.
It's kind of neat. Yeah, so down here at the far left end is the locomotive shop. And that's kind of end of track unless someday we extend that other line, which could continue on. But here's the line as it runs all the way across all the modules. And then here it enters the giant canyon.
That's the one that's going to be hard to work on, in my opinion.
Look at that, this big horseshoe curve, 8 feet up on the top of a cliff. And we've got to model those cliffs all the way up to like 9 feet on the wall. So that's it'll be fun. And then down below is the Colorado main line crossing through on a trestle as it comes out of the locomotive shop. So it should be impressive.
Yeah.
Right now there's not much there. But we're moving on right now to Strebel Springs.
Ah, that's a good name.
This little town over here is Angel's Camp, another really good name.
Yes.
But the pond here is Strebel Springs. Now, before we move on to that, I also want to put electricity to all of the track.
Oh, that's a good idea.
Well, we're doing. I want to wire everything. I want to
Yes.
pre-wire all the lights and get all the jumper wires over to the track. We haven't run any trains on here yet, even though the track is all in. I've been rolling things back and forth across here to test gauge. But this will be exciting. The first time trains will actually move on the logging railroad. So that should be fun. So that'll be first up is finishing up laying the track. I wanted to add a guardrail here on Steve's little trestle.
I think that's a good idea.
And we inherited that code 156 that he'd laid the whole thing with. And I've seen so many times where they use a lighter rail for the guardrail. And I love that look. And boy, do I love this look.
That does look good.
Doesn't that look neat? And I did it a little bit haphazardly, so it seems like, a logging railroad. Nothing too finely finished, but incredibly functional.
Yes.
So I wanted to sort of test these flangeways. If they're too tight, of course, that'd be a problem.
Oh, no kidding.
And make sure they actually function as a guardrail. So I drugged the mallee down here because, again, at this point, we had no power to the track.
No.
So I'm just sort of, dumb-handing it along and pushing it through here and checking all of the clearances and everything. There aren't really good NMRA standards for that, so you need to check. I also wanted to take out all of Steve's old vegetation.
That's a good idea.
Well, you saw how filthy,
it was
dusty.
just dusty and kind of worn out or something.
Well, he'd used a lot of natural moss vegetation and that sort of thing, and after 20 years it was all dried out. So it's like, let's just strip it out. And then on to wiring.
Right.
Now I'm following my usual practice of soldering one jumper lead to every single rail so that power never has to be carried through a rail joiner. This is also one of the seams where the modules tie together, so those rail joints have to slide. And then down here at the switch, I'm using a selectively controlled switch.
Oh.
So it's a solid frog and soldered all the way to the rails on the far side so that as you throw the switch, it kills the power to the track that's not aligned. Because I may not have a DCC up here at all times. And then, of course, you got to go through and clean up all these solder joints.
Oh, yes.
And make sure that there aren't bumps in the track where the flanges are going to hit. But there it is. All of these jumper wires. The jumper wires are a fairly fine gauge, but they only run for about a foot, and then they tie into a very heavy bus line. So we turned on the power.
Oh, here it goes.
Here we go. So the headlight came on, and trains actually started running for the first time.
Isn't that something?
And it was fun to check. Everything worked. All the clearances, all the gauging, the switch lines perfectly, and the trains just effortlessly glide up and down the track.
Isn't that a fantastic moment when that happens?
I've always been a little bit hesitant because then my tendency is to start playing with the trains. But
yes.
I'm going to stay dedicated to getting back to working and not playing trains.
Well, this is a playing. It's a test run.
It's a test run, exactly. So let's move on to construction of Strebel Springs. This pond right here is Strebel Springs, and this structure right here is the Badham Freight House, because it was built by Al Badham. And then I built this depot like 25 years ago and had it out in my yard, and it completely fell apart.
Yes, I saw just 4 walls.
That's all that's left.
Yeah.
And then Steve is building the Strebel Springs tank.
Oh.
And so he's constructing that over at his house, and we'll have to kind of figure out where that goes. So I went through and marked out the location of all the different structures here. And my plan was to put the depot up on top of the hill and the tank here where you see it marked out. But the more I fooled around with that, the more I thought, you know, it would look so much better if the depot were below the hill and the tank just shoved over. So I shoved the tank over several inches, and now I need to build a retaining wall.
You sure do.
Otherwise, the tank will fall off the hill.
Yes.
So the depot will sit here. There's the 4 walls of the depot. That's all that's left from the original depot. And then a little narrow walkway, and then the Badham Freight House over here, which I need to completely rebuild because it's also falling apart. It's more like 30 years old.
Oh my.
And all the glue joints are coming apart. So we've got some work to do over here to get all this up and running. So this should be a really neat setting over here.
It looks like it.
Especially once the pond is in. That'll be really spectacular. This is the tank.
Oh.
Now, I bought this kit years ago. I had 2 of these. Well, I had 1 of these on my HO Railroad, and I'd started construction on another one. It's a Hetchy kit of this HO tank. It's a really neat tank, and so Steve and I decided that would be a really neat tank for Strebel Springs. It's just that the HO model is slightly too small. So Steve is going to take the HO model here and the plans and sort of enlarge that to 1/20th scale at his house, which will make this whole thing 20 inches tall.
Oh my.
Now this is the second tank that I started work on years ago. Here's the rest of the tank.
Oh yeah.
As you can see, I never quite finished it.
No, there's a few parts.
There's parts. Parts is parts. But we have plans, and the plans are the big thing, and then we also have the finished model here. So Steve is just going to enlarge this thing up to 1/20th scale. First up, I need to build that retaining wall. Now these are molds that I made years ago, actually right after the space shuttle blew up.
Oh, really?
The Challenger
Oh, my
blew up.
Goodness.
Because Thiokol had to scrap out 100 pounds of Celastic because their program stopped, and I managed to buy the scrap on it for 25 cents a pound.
Oh my.
And it sold for $30 a pound.
Wow.
And so I made molds out of it.
Wow.
And I made this mold of a wall section, and I had one casting that I had poured years ago out of urethane, but my urethane had gone bad, and it was foaming, and it got all these bubbles in it. But I still have this wall.
The bubbles can be put to use.
Well, you know, and I can patch. So I thought, well, I'm going to use that wall section for several different things here at Strebel Springs. So that's going to be the retaining wall.
I see.
So I cut some sections out of that huge sort of brick wall casting, stone brick wall casting, and beveled that together and set in a set of footings, if you will, here, and figured out where that retaining wall was going to go. And then here's the footprint of the tank. That's where the tank will sit. So that should look pretty neat.
Looks good.
I like it on the hill this way, actually, with the retaining wall.
Boy, I see some bubbles there.
Yeah, it's a really bad casting, but I can fill those.
Yeah.
And I'm going to use that same product that I've been using on all of this stuff, that stuff that Steve put me onto, the golden pastel ground textured acrylic primer.
That is some wonderful stuff.
It works great, and it leaves behind kind of a sandy, gritty, stony texture, but it also fills in all kinds of little holes like that.
Well, look at that.
And I added some paint in so I could see better, because it's clear, and so I just added some gray paint, because it's going to be a gray wall, so that I can see where the bubbles are filling in and where they're not. And then I used some of this acrylic from the craft store and some from Walmart, in fact, and just painted in some of the bricks a slightly different color, so that it would look more like a real-life stone wall.
That looks great.
That looks pretty darn good. And once the mortar is in there, it should look awesome.
what do we have here?
Well, I wanted to see what the Stribble tank is going to look like at Strebel Springs, and all I had was the HO tank. So I just held the HO tank really close to the camera.
Oh!
Here I'm holding it with some needle nose pliers, but that way I can see what that 20-inch tall tank is going to look like when it's sitting on the foundation.
That's a good idea.
So here's the mortar added in.
That's good.
Again, it's just patching plaster, wall patching plaster, same technique that we used on the locomotive shop. So if you wonder how that's done, you can just look at the video on the locomotive shop. But putting that back in place, doesn't that look nice?
It looks wonderful.
Yeah, once the scenery and everything is in, that's going to be a great little retaining wall. So here again, here's the footprint, and I'm actually going to use a piece of foam core like this set in for the actual foundation underneath the tank. And then the tank will be removable. It's going to sit on blocks, like concrete blocks. They'll actually be made out of wood, and then that'll be pinned. The tank will be pinned into those so that we can lift the tank off for servicing. But that's what this is going to be here, is the actual base for the water tank. And then over here, the depot, and that's we need to get onto that, and then rebuilding Al's Freight House, the Bantam Freight House over here. Now this right here is actually a dam.
Right.
That's the front side of a dam, and the pond is on the other side, and this is the dam that creates the pond at Strebel Springs. So there's going to be a little floodgate here to control the spillway.
I think your finger's upside down.
Oh, oops. Let me fix. What I want to do is, this is such a great angle to look at Strebel Springs from, and there's the fascia board over there. So I'm thinking, you know, I need to use some of those urethane castings and some of that stone that you carved, and I'm going to glue that to the fascia board. Doesn't that look a lot better?
Oh, yes.
I also took one of Al's pine trees and stuck it up there just sort of for reference. And doesn't that make Camel Head Ridge look much better back there?
You know, it's so easy to see why you called it Camel Head Ridge.
Yeah, I had never noticed until one of the viewers pointed it out, but there it is.
There it is. Yeah, with the foliage gun, you see that.
Yeah, there's a sleeping camel on the other side of the ridge.
Oh, heavens.
So from now on, this will be Camel Head Ridge over here.
Sally the camel.
Yeah, I don't know how you tell the sex of a sleeping camel, but
we're not going to find out.
We're not going to find out. We'll just accept it. This is Sally the sleeping camel. But the technique I used for finishing the fascia board, we had some of these old Mountains in Minutes castings, and then you carved a bunch of castings too.
Right.
And so I'm using some of those. Steve suggested adding a little bit more in here. I also want to do at least one dead tree.
Oh, of course.
That'll be after it's all scenic and everything, but I just think that'll look really neat to have a dead tree with exposed roots clinging just barely to the cliff, and that'll add a nice detail to the... But since this is such a great viewing angle for Strebel Springs, that cliff is really important.
Exactly.
It's a little bit tricky to try to visualize how that huge water tank is going to sit in there. This is a picture of the tank as it currently exists. But I'm just sort of concerned that something that big sitting right there is just going to overpower the whole scene. So we need to convince Steve to bring the water tank over here so that we can test that. But in the meantime, let's go ahead and build the pond.
Here we go.
So laid out the diameter of the pond, and you can see again where the dam is over there. And this is how the freight house will overlap the pond. So the freight house is actually going to be on a pier.
Oh, neat.
Isn't that neat?
That would be cool.
And I like the look already of it just sitting over the area where the pond is going to be. I also cut out this piece of styrofoam. It's a really soft styrofoam, which is actually going to be used for the bank over there because it's going to have a cut bank like we did on our test pond.
Right.
And so I'm going to be using your cattails and vegetation, and this is really where what we were testing for a lot of that. So to cut out the section, I took the Zona saw with the short blade, and I just cut it at an angle like this all the way around the pond, and then I took a chisel and wedged that down into the crack and popped these sections out.
Wow, it's an island.
It's an island! And then I just sort of continued that technique all the way across the pond and suddenly realized, boy, if you ever wanted to model a quarry.
I was just going to say, this looks like Bryce Canyon or something.
Yeah,
Wow.
this is, but it's the same technique they use in a quarry. Anyway, on to shaping it with my Sureform rasp. So I dug out the Sureform that we used again on the test section, and now I'm shaping the banks and the bottom of the pond and getting rid of all those little ridges and everything, which really don't belong on the bottom of the pond.
No, not unless there's a lot of water coming in.
I kept thinking about Adam building his swimming pool, because what he's doing down in his backyard is looking suspiciously like what we're doing.
He has a much bigger rasp.
His is bigger, and his rasp is a backhoe. And then I'm using the same technique we used on the test section of painting acetone onto the extruded foam to create a cut bank over here in the little shallow areas.
Isn't that something?
So over here will be cattails and swampy stuff and fish and I don't know just what all. But that'll be the shallows with a cut bank. And I really like this technique of just brushing on the acetone. Of course, it also eats the styrofoam.
It sure does.
But doesn't that create a really nice looking cut bank?
Yes.
Now, setting the pilings, I needed a pile driver to build the pier. That's my pile driver.
There it is.
It's a drill bit. And I didn't need a drill in this soft material, so I just twisted the drill bit in there until the pilings fit in place. I'm using that dowel that I left out in the yard for 10 years, so it automatically it has natural weathering.
Natural weathering.
But there's the first bent
Oh, that looks good.
for the pier. Doesn't that look neat?
It's wonderful.
So I'm thinking it also needs a second bent just about under where the walls are to support the weight of the building better. So I'm going to go ahead and construct another bent and set the two just like this.
That's a good idea.
And then there's going to be overhead planking on this that'll key into the building. So again, the building can be lifted off for maintenance. And that should be the final look right there.
Oh, that's neat.
Now, I also decided in setting everything in place, it would look so much better if Al Badham's depot, his little freight depot, was up higher. So I decided to raise it up half an inch, which means building another wall. But I still have a lot of that stone casting.
You do.
So I chopped up a little more from that urethane casting. I used a little bit more of that thin styrofoam sheeting and built up a 1/2 inch foundation for the back side of the building. And then that allowed me to raise the bents up half an inch so that they stick more out of the water.
Well, exactly. You don't want wood sitting on the ground anyway.
No, and it just looks so much better if
It
there's
does.
good clearance between the building and the water.
Yes.
The casting tends to bow a little bit because it's a crappy casting.
Well, and that maybe looks a little more natural, though.
Well, and I can push it into place, so it's going to work just fine. So I went ahead. I need to do weathering on the cross pieces for the bents. They're brand new, where the pilings don't really need anything because they were out in the yard for 10 years. But the front and back pilings, I just used that Watco walnut stain.
There you go.
And just drizzled it from the top down. And doesn't that look nice?
It looks really real.
And it matches in really well with the... And it did run down some of the pilings, but
That's fine.
It gives it a really wonderful look.
Like Santa Monica Pier, actually.
But as you get right in close on those pilings, there's all kinds of little, I don't know... moldy moss-like.
It looks really real.
Because it is. I mean, like I
Yeah.
say, this is 10 years of weathering out in the backyard to create that effect. But there's the finished
There
pier.
it is.
I need to put the planking on the top, and not very much of that, just enough to key the building to it so that the building can be lifted off. But that will be the final look right there.
Oh, cool.
Isn't that neat? And there's almost enough room that you could wade underneath there should you want to get down there in the swampy material.
Crawdads.
Catch crawdads underneath the building or something like that.
I hear frogs.
And I want to use these frogs on the finished scene.
Oh, that will be neat.
I'm going to put a sound system with, and this is the track for the sound system.
That will be neat.
But it's just frogs and some crickets. I also went ahead and started painting the foundation.
Yes.
Same technique as I used for the retaining wall, because of course it should match the retaining wall, since they're really part of the same complex.
While you've been working on that, I have been working on my own layout. Somebody put me up to a challenge with an Altoid tin, so I thought, I can build it even smaller than theirs.
It's smaller than the layout out in the other room.
Way smaller.
But what I'd like you to do is help me with the depot. You want to do the interior?
Yeah, absolutely.
So you do the interior, and I'm going to work on the roof structure.
Yes.
Because there is no roof structure. There was a building fire, I suppose. So I'm going to go ahead and build the roof and the trusses for that if you want to do the interior.
Right.
And that will all be an upcoming show. Now, if you find all of this interesting, keep in mind that there is a playlist just on building this railroad, along with like 500 other videos.
Oh, yes.
And if you're enjoying this stuff, please share it with your friends and your railroad groups and that sort of thing. And if you're not a subscriber, please subscribe. And you can do that by clicking the blue button right there.
There it is.
Well, we're not sure how you found this video on the internet. We hope you didn't find it boring, and we will see you here on Tuesday. We'll show you some sort of collectible or something.
Right.
See ya.
See
Bye.
ya. Bye.